Hello everyone, today we talk about a probably very underestimated topic, that is the tessera and the tesserarius, constituting literally like pillars of Roman military discipline. You know that we talked about communication in the Roman army, you know how important this was basically at every level, like tactical, operational, strategical, etc. This is a topic, of course, that we could talk about for every army, but that in the case of the Roman one, considering especially her very harsh, consistent, and homogeneous discipline, really deserves a very important attention. Also, as far as the meaning of this message in more metaphysical terms, but not only. The Roman army is not just renowned for her discipline system and strategic efficiency, but for relying, and it could have not been otherwise given these premises, heavily on means of communication and administration to maintain its formidable presence across vast territories. Just think about this, like from the muddy fortifications of Hadrian's Wall to the sun-baked outposts of Egypt. Central to this system was the tessera, a small tablet of clay, wood, or wax used for records, orders, or passwords, and the tesserarius, the junior officer tasked with its management. These elements, though often overshadowed by the centurion's swagger or the legate's strategic command, I made a video about the hierarchy of ranks properly in the Roman legions, to what this corresponded to. This is mostly for officers telling the truth. We haven't looked much down the line, but we essentially assess the concreteness of Roman leadership in the handling, right, of properly armies, right, from the side of the Roman establishment. Then there is this other space that is exactly how this machine worked, which we know relatively few of, but that through the tessera and the tesserarius we can understand some of the most critical aspects. So today we will look at, as we usually do, ancient literary sources, recent archaeological insight, carrying out a more or less detailed historical analysis to reconstruct this world of military communication through the tessera, the tesserarius, and realizing how indispensable these were probably to make the Roman legions work. Looking at the origins, because as I was just saying, it's not like the Roman army was unique in this. Romans mostly did better than the others, right? But armies worked more or less in the same ways, pretty much all over the civilized world. The tessera was a small tablet containing the watchword or order, so nothing overwhelmingly complicated, something obvious that, in fact, at least from a documentary point of view, has roots stretching back at least to the 4th century BC in Hellas, as reported, at least later, by Aeneas Tacticus in his Poliorketica 2227. The author describes how a commander at the time would deliver to his sentries guarding the city walls a small stick bearing an impressed mark that is known in Hellenic as scutalis ecusan semeion, which was passed from one sentinel to another and returned to the commander at the end of the circuit. Right, so this was a very quick way to make also information passed by maintaining all the troops at their post, and basically also fostering this sense of we have this new information, like we must protect it. This was incredibly important because, so you can think of all the sort of hybrid, sort of mixed situations in which these troops could find themselves in. It said from the regulations of Amphipolis, especially in comparison to what we know with much more harsh Roman discipline, that the Hellenistic world was at least apparently less disciplined, right, in a military sense, and that, of course, the main problem was the possibility of spies disguised as civilians, etc., to get the actual orders, the actual information. So this simple mean of communication was obviously crucial. It had to end up in the right hands. In Hellenic, tessera, which is also like at least the Latinization is Thor, right? Possibly referring to the same shape of the tablet, or from Latin, but also in fact this would have occurred in the same Greek world, the 4 vigiliae, that are literally the wakes, the night watches of the guards specifically. So this would either refer to the shape of the tessera itself, or the fact that it was passed normally 4 times at night. And that during the day it was different, because of course you could have the same problem. The tessera could be used in the day as well, but it could be done also with the favor of the darkness, like to avoid, for example, showing that new orders had been issued, and so whoever was spying on this force would have had less chances to grasp what was going on. In any case, this simple but effective system allowed orders to be disseminated rapidly, as you can imagine, with the means of communication of the time, effectively, and most importantly, silently. There was no need to shout the order to let people hear what these troops were up to. In the Roman context, the tessera evolved into a versatile tool for military communication. Even further, we know much more about it, and how this was declined according to the levels of Roman rigid military discipline. It could be a wooden stick, as in the same Hellenic tradition, or a wax tablet inscribed with detailed orders. As tablets, as you know, were basically the simplest mean to write, especially this temper, like students used that, etc. Of course, there were the papier, then eventually, if we look at the early imperial period, we start already see what was called the pergamene. In fact, the membrane, like the skin, was sort of spreading a bit more. The Christians would properly develop the book as we know it, as opposed to the scroll for practical access to the Bible. But in general, like the most favorite mean in Rome, that was used actually from a very early time, was the tablet, right? There is an aspect we will deal with, if anything, later, that is to say, understanding how important written, and not to be given for granted, written culture was at the time, right? We assume that by the time of the Romans, it's mostly like just the Romans were civilized by other peoples, or at least other cultures made this widespread use of scripture. Naturally, the Greeks particularly did, if you look, of course, at Egypt, at Mesopotamia, from quite a long time. But when you actually look at the spread of writing on a map, aside from the main river cultures like across Eurasia and Africa, civilizations that mostly controlled those spaces, and that around were not even that literate, right? They had an easy sort of close to the barbarity in the form of probably lack of writing. If you look at the spread of literacy in the West, this basically starts with Italy as a whole, that in and of itself is a continental reality, as opposed to these other ones that mostly stretched across rivers and already found sort of a more sparse development in the surroundings. Think about Egypt or India, or even just certain spaces in terms of how much like more desert areas are present in the outskirts, etc. Italy has a very early literacy in a moment in which in Europe it had not even properly spread that far, because the Greeks mostly colonized all the coastline. But it's not that people became literate as a process of that, and Greece was also fairly small. It's not even just during the Hellenistic times. Most people were literate, or there was this enormous use of literacy in the major, even if you look at the great Hellenistic libraries, just courtier entered there fundamentally. The actual only people who really read things going to public libraries were the rough and primitive Romans, that were surely rough and primitive, but also quite literate. You can have both things at the same time. You've seen that the Romans, say, were the ones who used the first actual, let's say, the early artillery, as opposed to, I mean, they were using admittedly Hellenic engineers at that point, but the first usage dates back to their exploit against the Divolsky, etc. Just for saying how important in Roman and European culture a written transmission of orders to this consistency and uniformity is, even in the military of Rome, that is the one through which, by the way, literacy is spread all over Europe. Right? Europe got alphabetized by Rome throughout the conquest, and before that was not a thing. All right, so it's crucial to understand even what kind of edge the Romans had among the various things, at least through these secondary aspects that are, however, really crucial, because remember always the language was something much more sacred. Like classical languages like classical Latin were very hard sounding, rough, scanned languages that contained within themselves, according to properly the Indo-European. We will talk about the Indo-European phonetics, because this corresponded to the celestial movements that, with attached meanings in a universal metaphysical sense, would be passed through this. Think about all the sacred formulas, what was also inscribed, the names of the legions, the image on the images of the emperors. This language, this writing was sacred. Right? If you were to look at the BBC documentary, just look at how technologically advanced the Romans were. The spiritual element completely severed from the picture. But we will come back to this, and we'll see how much of a thing consistent it really was. Now, we have examples, by the way, of this also earlier use of the tessera. Figures like the tesserarius. For instance, the tribune Publius Decius, after setting up camp, had the tessera passed to all with the order to assemble at his position armed in silence at the signal of the second watch to receive instructions. We're told by Livy in his, of course, Ab Urbe Condita, Liber 7, specifically 735. We're talking, however, about Publius Decius Mus, right? And so we're talking about an episode that actually takes place basically in archaic Rome, at least in the 4th century BC. I made lots of videos about that period. And regardless of the fact that, of course, Livy writes at the turn of the millennium, so centuries afterwards, it's not like things would have changed that much. But if anything, by studying Latin paleography and codicology, we could get to even how plausible it could be, like the 4th century 4th century BC. Of course, Roman army would have that used, right? We'll probably talk about this also for the Republican period more in depth. Today we talk, if anything, just mostly about the early imperial period, right? Similarly, you have this other stories. The consul Aemilius had the tessera circulated among soldiers, instructing them to take up arms after breakfast. Livy 932. I would like to stress how Livy, and I made a video specifically about this, talking about probably the beginning of the stories and how the historian, in fact, describes the foundation of Rome, how, of course, traditional this is. And the fact that the tessera is described as still in these Roman sagas that, as you know, derived from, unfortunately, lost sources, but that were very much a traditional thing at the time. Like sacred poetry, as a matter of fact, is quite strong, because it shows how early this technicalities were taken into consideration. In another instance, the consul Livius Salinator, to deceive Hasdrubal about the identity of Roman forces, had the tessera circulated through the camp with the order to receive the army of his colleague Claudius Nero into their tents. Livy 27:46. As you know, these are events instead of the Second Punic War. By the way, among the greatest, Claudius Nero is a precursor also of the same Publius Cornelius Scipius tactics, fighting against the Carthaginians in Italy. We will talk about the Battle of the Metaurus River, that, as you know, is notoriously one of the most important battles in the history of mankind. What, again, strikes you here is how these examples illustrate the tessera's role in conveying precise, often complex commands with efficiency and secrecy. Archaeological evidence naturally supports the material concreteness of the tessera. In fact, excavations at sites like the famous Vindolanda, but also Carlisle, have uncovered wooden and lead tablets, some inscribed with military shorthand or symbols. We thank, of course, the British archaeologists for this deep dives they make with such extraordinary findings. A lead tessera from Chester, Deva Victrix, dated to the 2nd century AD, bears the inscription Legio Vigesima Valeria Victrix, because it's LEGXXV. All right, so it likely refers to the legion, the 20th Legion Valeria Victrix, suggesting, by the way, the use of this tessera for unit-specific orders or passwords. Similarly, a 2nd century AD lead tablet from Caerleon, Isca Augusta, so we are in Wales, as you understand, from the Celtic sounding name, appears to contain a watchword or unit identifier. These artifacts highlight the tessera's role as a tangible link between oral commands and written records, as we've seen, a cornerstone of Roman military administration. Because, by the way, this info wasn't just pertaining to strictly combat, say, operational purposes. It could simply also be about, how the camp was administrated. Just you needed to communicate something to someone. You didn't want it to be heard across. You just sent them this note. Because that's what basically got down to. Let's dive into the role and responsibilities of the tesserarius as a principalis. The circulation of the tessera was likely managed within each century. It's always the same problem with the Roman army. We don't really know too much about how things work down the line. As I said before, how actually cohorts work, like in relation to the same centuries, sometimes to the same maniples that actually still did exist even in imperial times, especially from an administrative point of view, but probably not only, because it's not like we have even the full certainty that after, say, the so-called Marian reforms, I made a video about them recently, anything really changed even about the segmentation of the troops in the cohorts, or better, we do know, of course, that troops tended to, the legionary infantry tended to be ever more homogeneous, but surely there would have been some organizational difference that may have gotten down not to the stereotypical status with the cardiophilax, that may have not even been, in fact, the full picture already, I don't know, in the 3rd century BC, right? But that surely remain a bit of a mystery also for later, the possible persistence. So when we're looking about the Roman century, especially in early imperial times, we're talking roughly 80 men, as far as we understand. And again, it could vary. It could be less, it could be more, as a matter of fact. And as you know, the century formed, in many ways, the backbone of the Roman legion. In many ways, one could argue at which level the cohort was more important identically. The maniple, maybe under some forms of operational forms, the century likely from a tactical point of view, but probably also more than that. Maybe the maniple itself, again, we do not really know at this point. But the most important aspect is, of course, the tesserarius managed the circulation of the tessera across this unit. That's why he was a specialized principalis, that, as you know, is an important figure in the Roman army, as the name itself says, that we could equate notoriously to a non-commissioned officer, right? In many ways, the centurion, the first spear, could be seen the first of the actual officers. In the Roman legion, it was already some kind of exception because of his particular career, but we will look at, I really made a video about centurions per se, and that's very interesting. It's obvious to us that in order to be a principalis, this tesserarius was an important figure in whom particular trust was placed. Especially if you are, say, ambushed by an enemy and you have to really have this information circulate across the unit. and in doing so, finding links also with the other ones, with the higher command. So it's actually a very, it's as if like this is the radio guy, right? In, I don't know, in a World War II context. The tesserarius was a junior officer whose title derived from the Latin tessera itself, as you understand, encapsulating his dual role as both a guard commander and an administrative linchpin. Far from, in fact, a mere functionary, he was military anyway. He reported directly to the same centurion, that of course was the big commanding and thus thinking brain in the picture, and that therefore needed to be constantly informed by the tesserarius about what was actually going on. It's not like, of course, at some point they wouldn't immediately know, at some, like for the smaller units. But imagine, I don't know, you're an occupation force, you have detachments, platoons here and there. These are the scenarios that unfortunately we don't have because centurions at large didn't write it. We just have, treatises from the nobility, as it's mostly the case, like throughout all the ancient medieval times at large, right? But the tesserarius also oversaw the security and bureaucratic pulse of the centuria itself, so also more relaxed circumstances, but not less important ones. His work ensured the legion's operational integrity across also different theaters that you can imagine, as we were saying here, literally stretching from Scotland to the Persian Gulf. During the so-called Roman Republic, the tesserarius role was obviously less formalized, as most of the principales one, that essentially before it's not even the Marian reform, but mostly Caesar's times, especially for the centurions, but fully with the Augustan military reforms. Made some videos about those, and we'll come back on them. The various principales had now constituted a specific standardized as professional cadre, just like legions had been now wholly, say, permanent, with their own identity, numerated, and so on. Before this, basically every Roman army was simply recalled, and if, say, you had risen up to the centurion's rank, you had to start over. Naturally, things would accommodate according to some greater functionality and efficiency, but there is all a theme, especially as far as the so-called 2nd century BC recruitment crisis goes. We have analyzed this in other videos. But from that era, in fact, Polybius, writing exactly in that century, describes the tesserarius as well as a legionary selected nightly from the 10th maniple of each infantry class, astati principes triarii. So we're talking about 30 maniples in the world legion, so there were 30 tesserarii for a single region. This was also actually connected with a cavalry unit as well. And they were tasked with disseminating the watchword. This is Histories 6:34-36. We would like to stress that the so-called Polybian army, that is basically the manipular one, even the Camillian one in its eventual development, the same Libyan one, etc., takes the names, like also in the latter cases you see, from the fact it was described by Polybius. And that tells us that the century was roughly 60 men at the time, which means that if you double that for the maniple, you have more or less the size of a company. So the notion that the tesserarius was basically connected with the most important, as a principalis, with the most important tactical unit of the legion, so the one that was commanded by essentially an officer that controlled every man down the line, right? Because he knew each of them, and there was really no delegation, like for the higher commanders, is crucial, because it tells you how, again, important this tesserarius was for the communication, say, during in open field, and not only, as we explained. Now, this still, according to Polybius, this temporary assignment exempted the soldier in question the tesserarius thus from regular guard duty, which made him immunis, highlighting how the tesserarius, at least in this earlier era, was a role rather than a rank, because the latter hadn't probably been formalized yet. It can be easily understood. I mean, there would be, again, we don't know exactly how this would happen in later times when there were formal tesserari, but you can imagine some kind of mobility, possibility of rising, falling from the rank. Polybius details a rigorous system to prevent leaks, by the way, information leaks. The tesserarius delivered the tessera to the first sentry, who passed it along the chain, with any failure triggering an inquiry and immediately a punishment in case of inadempience, we were told by the Histories 634. By the imperial period, however, as we understood, the tesserarius position had solidified into a permanent junior officership, or NCO if you prefer, reflecting the professionalization of the Roman army, especially under Augustus, that settled probably the fundamentals of the Principate. Also, as far as the army was concerned, been a huge problem, especially at the end of the civil wars, with all those men to compensate with land. So it's been pointed out how this development mirrors the broader shift from a citizen militia to a standing army, where specialized roles like the tesserarius became essential for managing larger, more complex legions. Of course, my impression is that especially for the 2nd century BC, we have this notion that everything was so decadent, or that the Romans could have simply taken over de facto the entire Mediterranean without having something like akin to a professional army. De facto, it already was, even before the Marian reform or even the Augustan one, but it had not been fully fixed or formalized, right? So it's not like that the Romans were a simple militia. They were already professionals, but just their structure, their organization, their cadres had not been fully institutionalized within a permanent army, right? So that's, of course, important. It's not, of course, the later Roman army was better also as far as professionalism was concerned, but de facto, since the Second Punic War, and in certain ways also before, since the first, the Romans had really taken this very far, right, to a point that you can't equivocate. Even when they were fighting across Italy, frankly, like the resources, the manpower are really big, and it's basically since the siege of Veii that we're told the Romans were actually paid by the state, at least compensated for some of their military expenses for the service in the legions. Nevertheless, the tesserarius pay 1.5 times that of a regular legionary, sesquiplicarius, marked his elevated status. So he was really understood as a better man. Not an overwhelmingly better, but still like a solidly important one. Inscriptions such as the Corpus Inscriptionum Latinarum 1369-55 from Mainz record tesserari among the principales alongside optiones and signiferi. I made a video about the latter, specifically indicating their position within the century's hierarchy. The salary combined with opportunities for promotion to optio or even centurion, that naturally were more important ranks, made the role a stepping stone for ambitious soldiers. So there was some specific ability connected with this role that opened to sort of greater opportunities of career within the ranks. Epigraphic evidence further underscores this status of the tesserarius. For example, the dedication of a tesserarius himself named Aurelius Marcellus, again this is this CIL, the Corpus Inscriptionum Latinarum, etc., 14387 from Dacia, 2nd century AD, listing the tesserarius service along his unit's achievements, with another from Aquincum, Pannonia, CIL 33523, mentioning a tesserarius who funded a votive altar indicating personal wealth accrued through his pay. Probably not only his pay, but we'll talk about this important topic in some video. We've never really done it, right? In any case, we get the impression as if like the Roman legionary was just a guy that received a salary and didn't have any specific status, even just in the local community. Where no, that was deeply felt in a quasi knightly aristocratic sense, as someone elevated, right, provided with a kingdom militaris, a Roman citizen in the legion, of course, and as a force of occupation, at least, being the superior conquerors lording over the locals. Let's go look at properly the administrative duties of the tesserarius, that in this sense was also a bit of a bureaucratic backbone in the Roman military. The Roman army was at some point, at least like not much in this period, but of course had like a very administratively developed entity. It had to be properly run, and it was by far the most efficient element of the Roman state, so to say. So a bureaucratic behemoth, also for times where we don't normally speak of bureaucracy, that, as you know, is something that especially takes off in the later empire. In reality, aside from what we said before about this very imbued literary culture, etc., we would be surprised by how light the Roman army bureaucracy really was, how much the legions worked actually without too much of centralized control. But this is actually what highlights the role of the tesserarius as a key player in its tablet trail. He was responsible for compiling and submitting guard reports, which detailed sentry activities, incidents, and breaches of protocol. So any kind of information, serious one, of course. These reports, often inscribed on wax tablets or papyrus, also, again, depending, because the tablet was handier, for example, on campaign, but the Roman legions used papyri out there. Also, in some interesting. I've studied Latin codicology, but I've never encountered too much, let's say, Roman military, especially in this earlier time, like kind of evidence, etc. We know, of course, we have stuff from the military, like the same tessera, etc. But unfortunately, we don't know too much of how or where they were practically stored. In any case, these reports were forwarded by the tesserarius to the centurion, and in some cases to the camp prefect or legate as well, if the information was, of course, particularly sensible. Subliterary sources such as the Vindolanda tablets from Britain, we are between the 1st and the 2nd century AD, offer insight into this administrative world. Documents like the Vindolanda table 2-154, that is a strength report detailing guard assignments, suggests the kind of records the tesserarius managed, reflecting the meticulous nature of Roman discipline and camp life, military administration. The tesserarius also maintained the centuries duty rosters, assigning soldiers to guard shifts and ensuring equitable rotations among the troop. This task required balancing fairness with practicality to maintain morale as well, because so many things depend probably also on the discretion of this guy, as we've seen. Even the watch duty is also filtering messages, right? Very important. Inscriptions from Dura Europas, such as the Dura 101, we are here a bit later, like in the 3rd century AD, list soldiers assigned to specific posts, a process also in this case likely overseen by the tesserarius. His literacy was crucial, as you understand, like as orders and records were typically in Latin, even in provinces where Hellenic or local languages dominated. This set, especially in the Roman army, wouldn't be that much of a problem. We can imagine the auxiliaries having an equivalent of this, and we know much less about those. But it's important because the auxiliaries still worked within a Roman system, so they themselves were to communicate at least between the various units in Latin as well. And here literary proficiency had to be really connected also with the effectiveness of the communication, right? Not just with what, the tesserarius wasn't just a passive medium of this information. He also had to probably, again, evaluate which information was the most important to be passed to the higher ranks, but also how to interpret it in certain circumstances, which may have not been fully clear. In fact, regardless of the tessera, probably the tesserarius got other information in different ways that he had to refer to the centurion. This would have actually occurred also through basically the entire troop, right? But the tesserarius likely was specialized in that kind of communicational proficiency, aiming at the effectiveness of the message delivery. This set principales like the tesserarius apart in an army where many legionaries were functionally illiterate as well. And as the Romans said, scripta manent, verba volant. So also probably the writing culture, the written culture of this individual had to be quite substantial. The tessera itself was central in all this. The tablets, often wood, wax, as we've seen, or lead even, carried the nightly watchword typically, but not only. This could be a simple phrase or name. For example, Roma or Virtus, that we analyze as, well in their traditional meaning. These were easy. We can't fully know the entire picture, of course. If anything, they were designed for easy recognition. They would have changed in a way that, a spy, someone intruding, would have not necessarily known about for the night. The tesserarius collected the watchword from the centurion or camp prefect that decided which one it had to be, and that therefore had to be quite clever at that level as well, right? So remember, again, the tesserari could become centurions themselves at some point, so they would have known how the entire mechanism worked. So the tesserarius was the guy distributing, so which like centurion or camp prefect even relied on for the distribution of the tessera to the sentries, ensuring its secrecy. Vegetius, naturally later source of the even late 4th century, in his De Re Militari, that however does tell, as a lot also ideally about the olden times, describes the tesserarius as the keeper of the watchword, responsible for its secure distribution. This is De Re Militari 2.7. Tacitus, in his Histories 1.25, alludes to the role's importance in maintaining camp discipline, ensuring sentries remain vigilant against infiltration or desertion. This is important because, as you know, Tacitus was a highly nobiliar patrician source, but he would also know how important this role was in order to talk about it in his works. It's also interesting and fascinating to think about the psychological aspect of that. Imagine the security of a nightly watch. Think about the meanings attached to darkness, the incumbent threat, like the possibility of the crawling elements of the world to assail you, to ambush you, to infiltrate with the cover of the same darkness. There was something very archetypal in it. And just think about being, again, a Roman soldier on the frontier and having to cope with this, and how much you would rely on things like watch words. The tesserarius' most visible duty was as guard commander himself, particularly in the Roman castrum, the Roman camp. Each night, in fact, he was the one organizing the sentries, as we've seen, assigning them to posts along the ramparts, gates, or key structures like the Principia headquarters, have a series going on, but we will complete it, about the various parts of the Roman camp, right? That, as you know, was ideally built always in the same form, even and organized in the same way, even though it wasn't quite true, but it more or less did follow that pattern. This was a high stakes task. A single lapse could expose the camp to attack, as seen, for example, in Tacitus' account of a near disaster at Vetera in 69 AD, where lax sentries allowed Batavian rebels to infiltrate. This is an episode of the stories 422. The tesserarius' ability to select reliable sentries and enforce discipline was critical to the legion's survival. Thus, the watchword system managed by the tesserarius was a cornerstone of camp security. An inscription like the CIL 313-665, there is a dedication to tesserarius in Dacia, highlight the pride taken in this role. The tessera's distribution was a ritualized process, reinforcing the chain of command, but also the faith that had to be put in this message and the trust in the tesserarius himself. Soldiers failing to return the correct watchword faced severe consequences, as outlined in the later Roman source of Digest of Roman Law 4916. This was essentially the Theodosian Code updated by Justinian, which lists dereliction of guard duty as a capital offense, which had always been, in fact, a thing in the Roman army. The tesserarius, as the enforcer of this system, held significant authority, acting as the centurion's eyes and ears during the night. Just again, imagine, especially on campaign, what kind of responsibility derived from this duty, the danger, the risk, the threat ever present in such moments. Archaeological evidence from Roman forces, such as those along Hadrian's Wall, provides context for these duties. Excavations at Hausstead's Vercovicium have revealed guard towers and gatehouses with small rooms possibly used for storing tesserae or posting duty rosters. Finds like bronze stelae, that is to say writing tools, and wax tablets suggest a highly organized guard system with the tesserarius at its heart. By the way, the stellate comes from stulus, as it was literally this little knife that you use to etch in the wax. All right. Now, the tesserarius' role extended to inspecting the same sentries, at a point ensuring they remain alert, a task requiring both leadership and a knack for spotting malingerers. This is interesting because it shows like the measure and countermeasure, the watch and counterwatch that really spreads also that security among the sentinels as general troopers in this circumstance, and made them ever more confident in their role, right? The enemy knew, generally speaking, aside from whom they worked, there were other Romans during civil wars, etc. But also, let's say the barbarians would have known essentially what Roman defenses amounted to, even just, and especially in terms of men and their moral force. There is naturally also a visual and material identity of the tesserarius that matters. His appearance likely mirrored that of a regular legionary, clad in, you would find the famous so-called lorica segmentata, or the amata, armed with a gladius and pugio, and carrying a scutum. So again, it's just like the centurions. I mean, there was actually an important variety in Roman arms and armor throughout this period, regardless of the, let's say, basic uniformity that they could in fact develop upon. So, if anything, we will get more into the details of this aspect. No definitive evidence suggests, however, distinctive insignia for the tesserarius, which doesn't mean that there would have not been, right? Funerary reliefs offer clues about this. This was the image, especially Romans cared very much about the image of the man. I talked about this as far as his genius and the different souls, including one that was to remain for a while on earth if it hadn't made it into the firmament, and actually a telluric one that pertained to the genie of the ancestors. The Romans cared very much about people died as much as they had lived, and this is actually a part of Romanity that was the sort of most archaic element of it they could have easily found among the Celts, the Germans, and more at this point. So looking at the stele of a Roman legionnaire is never something, okay, well, it's merely decorative or sort of visual, artistic. There is a hidden meaning behind it. This tale of Gaius Largenius from the Legio Secunda Augusta, Strasbourg, 1st century AD, depicts a legionary with a wax tablet tucked into his cingulum, a military belt adorned with bronze plates. This is, by the way, more specifically the inventory number 2431 at the Landesmuseum Württemberg. Similarly, the fragmentary stele of Annaeus Daversus from the 4th cohort of Dalmatians, early 1st century AD, shows a soldier with a tessera, remember what we said before about the auxiliaries, suggesting this object as a marker of the tesserarius role. Besides, these reliefs align with Trajan's column, where soldiers carrying tablets appear in administrative scenes, possibly representing tesserari or similar principales. A debated artifact is the tesserarius staff mentioned in some, at least modern reconstructions. In fact, it's been claimed that the tesserarius would carry 6-foot wooden staff topped with a bowl, used both as a symbol of authority and as a weapon, which could also help a bit like the optio to maintain formation, etc. No primary source or archaeological find confirms this. And in fact, this is to be actually dismissed as speculative, at least likely conflated, in fact, with the optius asti that we were hinting at, and we'll make a video on. Again, it's not like it's impossible for this to have happened at all, but we don't just have any specific evidence of this, and it may have been that the whole thing was carried like a different being. Like, for example, like the tesserarius could not wield such a weapon specifically. And again, they would have been the same people handling, often literally the same people, because at different times of their service they would have passed through these roles. But again, this is why these roles existed, and why instead we see them. We see them characterized, differentiated one from the other. In any case, the tessera itself remains the tesserarius' most reliable identifier. It's, as we've seen from the stele, its portability and utility reflecting his role's blend of bureaucracy and command as well. Because again, he was a principalis, he was an NCO, so he was definitely an important figure, also combat-wise. It's not like he had this function so he wouldn't fight, right? This is not the case. He could have been sheltered or better protected in that role, but he was a soldier anyway, and he was trained in the same identical way like all the others. In fact, this is interesting too, like thinking at the tesserarius in action, in a life of duty, like the Roman one was in a deeply military and religious sense. Imagine, I don't know, a tesserarius in a legionary fortress like the one of Vindonissa in modern Switzerland, roughly at the beginning of the 2nd century. As dusk settles, he receives the watchword from the centurion, inscribed on a wax tablet. He assigns sentries to the ramparts, checking their alertness with a sharp word or a glance. By lamplight, he scratches out the night's guard report, noting a soldier's tardiness for disciplinary action. On campaign, he marches with the sentry, ensuring records are packed securely, ready to set up the nightly camp's defenses. In battle, he fights as a legionary, his administrative duties deferred until the dust settles. His literacy, reliability, and ability to manage men under pressure make him a candidate for promotion, but his current role is no less vital. This life was not without risks, of course. Like in the Roman legions at large, the tesserarius' visibility as a junior officer made him a target for disciplinary backlash or enemy ambushes. Inscriptions like the CIL 82553, that is a tombstone from Lambyses, record tesserari who died young, some in their 20s, suggesting the toll of campaign life. Yet the role offered rewards, a higher salary, as we've seen, prestige within the century, and a path to roles like optio or cornicularius. I made a video about the Roman musicians, so to say, of the Roman army, but there is a specific meaning and higher functions in these two. Again, all these were not subsidiary auxiliary functions. Some, like you could see, I don't know, with a knight and as you've seen the Teutonic trumpeter, I made a video on recently. No, they were considered actually superior to the others, exactly because of their leadership role, right? The other troopers, it's of course, you could more secularly, modernly interpret like, what was the Roman army like compared to, again, literally like a medieval one with knights and squires, right? It's as if, the Roman legionary had been in the older ancient warrior sense, a knight himself, or at least one, provided with the cingulum militaris. Knights were understood, of course, as the equites in a higher fashion. I made videos in this sense, but let's say these being all a bunch of troops like acting as one, right, and needing this direction from the top, and the top had been the same guys that were basically like them, but actually slightly superior. As you understand here, depending, of course, like if you take the first spear centurion, that's a guy who would have really counted many soldiers. We'll see this also regarding the pay, etc. Here we understand the tesserarius to have been surely of that kind of word, right? So can we make some broader consideration about the overall meaning of the tessera and the tesserarius in Roman military culture? Well, they were indeed a unique blend of martial and administrative prowess in the Roman army, unlike the heroic ideals of Hellenic hoplites or the tribal warfare of Rome's enemies. The Roman legion thrived on this regulatory aspect that, again, was actually all one with that too. It's not saying that, because we often tend to understand also for example, the Hellenic hoplites as something detached from the warrior element, and even when we consider it as such, it's as if we couldn't conceive that there is a warlike aspect, an individualistic aspect, even essentially a material type of warfare like the Hellenic one really was. The Roman one was much more bloodily military, in that, as we've seen, almost aristocratic sense of the individual, but still framed in an egalitarian system that needed these principales, ensuring smooth operation of the wall. That's the idea of the fasces. That's the idea of the sacred bundle properly that acts like one. Other peoples had similar concepts as well. We will not digress specifically on that. But the tessera, whether for passwords, orders, or records, embodies also the army's reliance on written communication that is still a rarity in the ancient world. I can't stress this enough. Again, if we talk about the early Roman Empire, everybody says, but the Greeks, but these previous civilizations. Look at how many people actually wrote in Europe, right? Not the Atlantic coastland. That is fairly limited and is smaller than the Italic interland. And look, in fact, how what the Romans produce, in not just in terms of military, whom they take over, and what kind of literacy they had already reached. Again, I can't stress enough, because we unfortunately live in this dichotomic reality where we see that the barbarian is just as a guy that does not, at least in a primitive archaic reality, like, for example, like there must be less literacy, right? Not really. The Romans had an incredibly high literacy, even in the archaic period. And it's something weird indeed. It's like, again, there is, of course, literacy in literacy, but this is real, the real one. It's not like, just like saying, I don't know, the Helvetii that knew how to write in Greek with Greek alphabet for their own administrative issues before the migration. Caesar tells us. Here we're talking literally a widespread written culture and practice in the Rome of the 4th century BC already, and pretty much down the line. And that's that egalitarian aspect that really makes you think, because you realize that the Romans were not, say, as materially developed as the Greeks in some aspects, but by that point, but they already were, in a sense, having a different relation with writing compared to them, and just they had a different mindset, different culture. So it's not easy, it's not univocal to assess, again, the spread of literacy. And the way the Romans spread literacy is also unique in the ancient world, right? You don't have any people of the literate ones at this point of the great millenary civilizations that went out there conquering and spreading written culture. They remained where they were. They used that mostly for their own administrative purposes. That's pretty much it. It was an eternal thing. The Romans go out in the world and they literally spread written culture to the way we know it, fully developed, for example, by the early Middle Ages, in the way we also document, debunking the myth that the early Middle Ages were a moment of scarce literacy, compared truly to the rest of the world, especially in the West, that is instead often understood, but no, weren't there the barbarians at that point, etc.? No, right? The West also, through Rome, kept having a much widespread literary culture down the line than other cultures. The Byzantine Empire wasn't like that. The Arabs weren't like that. And so also we have to look at which parts of Europe indeed, but there is no doubt that especially Romance Europe, right, post-Roman Europe had a massive level of literary production, an incredible level of literary thriving in those centuries as well. Right, and this had all started from Italy. Again, one of the few beautiful history videos I've ever watched on YouTube was showing the spread of literacy since the dawn of civilization throughout the world. And look at the dynamic of Italy compared to, say, Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, China. They arrived later. Even Greece, look at Greece. They spread literacy just as far as within their own world, so just the colonies. They didn't mix with anybody. The Romans spread literacy all across continental Europe. It's something utterly insane. And this was already happening a bit before with the Etruscans, for example, fostering the Futhark through, for example, like the contacts with Scandinavia. So it wasn't even just something new or sudden. The Romans had something even just randomly ingrained. It came from a specifically civilizational development that is much older than we tend to think. In fact, I have a video incoming also on the Italian maritime antiquities that talk about a very obscure but also incredibly fascinating topic, that is to say, before Rome, what was actually, and before, say, aside from the Greeks, from probably the Italian mainland, what was the actual activity in terms of maritime practice in that specific sense. This is Again, incredibly important. It shouldn't be given for granted. We'll look at it some other ways. Now, in general, again, the material legacy of forts, tablets, and inscriptions reveals a military culture obsessed with documentation, or at least very rigidly disciplined along that pattern, where the tesserarius was a vital node. And this perfectly explains what the Roman civilization had really become by that point. And there is also an interesting debate regarding whether the tesserarius could have a potential involvement in espionage or signal coordination. A very early video of mine was based on that sort of light signaling, for example, of the Roman army. Spionistic activity could actually be there, to considering his proficiency in communication. Like, he may have, for example, say once enemy troops were captured, there could have been ciphered codes or something like that. He may have been versed even in foreign language. And yes, also the barbarians wrote things down, and not just also the most civilized people. So surely when Caesar talks about the Helvetii writing that Greek, we can imagine some Roman tesserari being tasked after the annihilation of the Helvetian army to have been properly tasked to study like their records, what they had written on them, in Greek, by the way. So this is in a Celtic context, right? It's incredibly interesting. There is sadly, however, no primary evidence supporting any of this, which again doesn't mean it wasn't there. We just don't know about it. And so yes, it's possible. But let's say the idea of the tesserarius being routinely involved in espionage, this is too much like fictional, right? More plausibly, his role intersected with the one of other principales. So in this strict circle, together with, say, the signifer that again I made a video on, or the cornicularius, creating a network of NCOs, sustaining the century's cohesion. Espionage, why using a tesserarius? Why using a legionnaire that had that specific purpose? Where you could use spies of all kind, right? And also probably better ones than a tesserarius in different other tasks, right? So it's really important. Probably even in reenactment, there is a possibility of imagining during those same activities how you would transfer communications if you want to try to simulate that at a camp level without smartphones or whatever. So it would be really interesting to look at. But at the same time, it's going to remain speculative. I think this is interesting as a topic because it really blends all the possible aspects that we can expect from a tesserarius task and duty, and can, if anything, bring a bit of justice, let's say, to this figure that is notorious, of course, but not considered among sort of the top ones, because also like a signifer has the signum. The music players have this, they're more picturesque, right? Even just in the way they're represented. But the tesserarius has just the actual tessera. He writes, right? It doesn't sound very cool, but again, this may come to harshly as a judgment just from the fact that as modern people, we tend to focus too much on the technology at hand and not the actual roles of these figures in the army, their actual function. And all these videos should have revolved around how, let's say, possible scenarios in which the tesserarius would have had to especially deal with this communication in combat, on campaign. So in moments that surely tested his specific abilities, capacities, etc. Surely gathering information again from different sources at the same time. However, not much as a spy or whatever. Again, these guys were very well within the legion where they were. You actually wanted and you needed them there, as we've seen. They really received the passwords from the very heart of the Roman camp, sometimes from the very legates of the were their role really was so crucial, so central, so intimate to the Roman legion. Right, probably the tesserarius guarded the probably the codes of the entire Roman army, the orders. It's an overwhelmingly important role, and as such should really be, if anything, more appreciated compared to what you could see, like how many videos have been made on the tessera. You have to check this out, because I'm always curious about this stuff, and then I can't complain about other channels like I've done recently and complain in turn because you watch that more than that my historical content like this, that I'm sure not going to get many views. So tesserarius, surely with AI there will be all kind of empty stuff. What the hell? Come on. Oh yes, there are all shorts actually, and there's nothing. Wow, there's literally nothing aside from shorts. So this is great. Maybe I'm going to get more views exactly because of this. Yeah, there are tesserarius from the Playmobil toys. So that's very interesting. Yeah, there are the references to the Principales, etc. But there's no video actually about the tesserarius. And oh my god, there is so much AI. It's disgusting, right? I've been complaining a lot about people stealing copyrighted pictures. They do it all the time, especially in shorts. This is terrible, really. Nobody does anything about it. I'm the only person who actually uses all Creative Commons images, but AI, my god, it's terrible. I mean, I use AI as well, but I use it at least in a way that I can replicate the actual pictures in a way that are correct, and it takes a lot, telling the truth. This is really something else. This is really worse, and again, it's just image for image and nothing else. And it's starting, especially that's the worst, it's starting to substitute in the search results, etc., the actual stuff you find in like the more real stuff, right? So this is incredibly important to point out, because there doesn't seem to be properly a check here. It's terrible, and it's very difficult to do actually anything about it. I hope this was really interesting. To me, it was very interesting. I don't know about you. These are the videos that usually get less views, but right, it's a very important part of the Roman military, and we will see the role of the tesserarius or his equivalent also in other eras. Today we talked about the early empire, and mostly we stuck to that, but as always with the Roman army, you have to necessarily cite Polybius, you have to cite Vegetius, because it's just that scattered information. We have just this few explicit references to them, and we rightfully can imagine the role of the tesserarius not to have particularly changed, all right, over time. So yeah, for today, however, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.